Today, we are going to dive into some truly chilling research. It tackles a really disturbing question: what's going on inside the minds of people who commit the worst crimes you can imagine, all while in service to the state? Okay, just for a second. When I say the word psychopath, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably some movie villain, right? Or maybe a famous serial killer you saw in a documentary. Someone who just can't fit into society, has a long rap sheet. Got that image? Good. Hold on to it. Because I'm willing to bet you didn't picture a national hero, a celebrated officer, covered in medals, a respected leader. And that, right there, is why this story is so fascinating and so deeply unsettling. So we're looking at a group of men who somehow lived these two completely opposite lives. On one hand, they were pillars of their country. On the other, they were convicted of the absolute worst kinds of crimes. I mean, how does that even happen? The people in this study we're digging into were former military and police officers in Chile who served under the Pinochet dictatorship. Now, these weren't just low-level guys. We're talking high-ranking officials, generals, colonels, majors. And after the regime collapsed, they were convicted of absolutely horrific crimes against humanity. We're talking murder, kidnapping, torture, all sanctioned by the state. So this just raises the question: how did men who were seen as heroes secretly become monsters? To really get a handle on these men, you have to understand the world they lived in. The environment they were in wasn't just messy. It was a system that was basically designed to find and promote a very specific kind of person. So, back in 1973, a military coup puts General Pinochet in power. Right away, his regime sets up a secret police force, the DINA, to crush any opposition. This whole thing was part of an even bigger network of state-sponsored terror across the continent called Operation Condor. And even when the DINA was officially shut down, the work just kept going under a new name. This was an entire era built on state-sanctioned violence. And here's the key takeaway from the research on this. This brutal system wasn't just something that happened around people, it actually created opportunities. The paper calls it a fertile ground for ambitious and unscrupulous men to just thrive. In a world like that, not having a conscience wasn't a problem. It was a qualification. So how in the world do you get inside the heads of men like this so many years after the fact? Well, a team of researchers got this incredible, unprecedented access and used what is basically the gold standard for measuring a very specific and very misunderstood part of the human personality. They used a tool called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or the PCLR. Now, this is not some pop psychology quiz online. It is a deep clinical assessment that has to be done by highly trained experts. They do these incredibly long interviews, and then they comb through every available record. We're talking court documents, prison files, you name it, all to score a person on 20 very specific traits tied to psychopathy. Okay, and here's what's so cool about the PCLR. It shows that psychopathy isn't just one thing. It's really made up of two big parts, or factors. Factor one is all about the core personality. Think grandiose, manipulative, a total lack of remorse. That's the internal stuff. Then you've got factor two, which is the behavioral side, the impulsive, unstable, openly criminal lifestyle. A long history of crime, getting into trouble as a kid, all of that lives in factor two. You have to remember this difference because it is literally the key to this entire puzzle. All right, so let's get to the results. This is where it all builds to truly chilling psychological profile. What the researchers found when they scored these men was a total shocker, but probably not for the reason you're thinking. At first glance, nothing really jumped out. When you looked at their total psychopathy scores, the human rights violators scored about a 21. A group of typical maximum security inmates scored a 20.9. I mean, they're practically identical, and of course, way higher than an average person from the community. So that's it, right? Case closed? They're just like any other criminals? Nope, not even close. And here it is. This is the big reveal. When the researchers split the scores into those two factors, the whole picture just flipped upside down. For factor one, that core personality of being callous, manipulative, and remorseless, these officers scored in the 92nd percentile. I mean, sky high. But for factor two, the history of impulsive, antisocial behavior, they scored way down in the 25th percentile, rock bottom. Their profiles were the exact opposite of a typical criminal. So what does a profile like this actually mean in the real world? It describes someone who is incredibly callous and manipulative on the inside, but they don't have that classic criminal record. In fact, these military academies wouldn't have even let them in if they had a history of delinquency. These were men who, on the outside, were totally functional. They were successful, climbing the ranks of a respected institution. They had the core personality of a psychopath, but it was sort of dormant or channeled until the state gave them the permission and the power to let it loose. And this link, this connection between their psychology and their success inside the regime, well, that might be the most important discovery of all. Let's see how this actually played out in the chain of command. Well, get this. When the researchers organized the group by military rank, they found this stunning straight-line pattern. The junior officers, they had the lowest scores on that core psychopathic personality, that factor 1. Middle-ranking officers, they scored higher. And who do you think had the highest scores of all? You got it, the senior generals. The further up the ladder you went, the more profoundly manipulative and remorseless the person tended to be. So here's the bottom line. In a twisted world of the Pinochet regime, the core traits of psychopathy weren't a problem. They were a career advantage. The very things that define factor 1, being deceptive, lacking empathy, being ruthlessly focused on a goal, those were the exact qualities that got you a promotion. The system was actively selecting for these traits. The authors of the study really just said it perfectly. They called these men ambitious, unscrupulous, and opportunistic individuals who seamlessly adopted a role as defenders of the state. They didn't succeed in spite of who they were. They succeeded because of who they were. And that just leaves us with this final, really unsettling thought. This study hands us a detailed blueprint for a specific kind of person, high on the core traits of psychopathy, but low on the obvious criminal behavior. It's a personality that looks successful on the outside, but is ruthless on the inside, and it absolutely thrives in chaos and unchecked power. So the question for all of us is, if this profile was so successful in a military dictatorship, where else might we see it today? In what other high-stakes environments could this hidden psychopathy of power be playing out right now?